So we're walking through 1 Corinthians, which is a book in the New Testament. It's also a letter that's sent by a figure named the Apostle Paul to a church that he started about 4 years earlier in the Greek city of Corinth. And he's responding. They've had some communication going back and forth, and there's some people from that church that had some concerns and some questions, and so he's just speaking into that. And right now we're about 4 or 5 chapters in. And during the first part of the book, Paul's really been setting a foundation for something that he feels like they can use a healthy dose of, and that's just humility. Their culture is very focused on how you can gain and attain honor for yourself. It's very philosophical, and so they're focused on what makes sense logically, or sometimes what brings the most pleasure and what avoids the most pain. And so their way of viewing things in a lot of ways contradicts with the way that Jesus' way of life is trying to lead them. And so the Apostle Paul is trying to help these believers in the church in ancient Corinth just navigate life on kind of that basic understanding of what humility is. And they have a lot to learn. And so Jesus on the cross is Paul's greatest illustration of what it means to be humble. Here you have God of the universe stepping out of everything that's glorious in heaven, coming to a world that's filled with people being selfish and causing harm and injustice, and then taking on all of that on himself on the cross. And that, if you want to see humility encapsulated in one person, look at the God of the universe taking that upon himself. And so Paul's saying, in light of who Jesus is, why do you want to lift yourselves up and exalt yourselves? Like, why would you want to live that way? Jesus shows us a much better way, and that involves humility. So that's the basic view of the first part of this book, this letter of 1 Corinthians. But we're stepping into a discussion. Last week, here's a quick review. Let me get I have a little clicker here so I can advance some of these slides on my own. But last week, we looked at this question. What are some of the outward signs of humility? Before that, we looked at some of the internal signs of humility. And we learned last week, it's taking on humble roles sometimes. If you've been a parent or you've been responsible for other people, you have to do things at times that are inconvenient, that are unpleasant, that are uncomfortable, that are humble. And the Corinthians were not looking for those types of roles, even with each other in a church. They wanted things that were going to bring them attention and honor and recognition. And Paul's saying that's not the way Jesus lived. It's also living on humble resources. And for some of us, we have plenty. And maybe humble resources for us is giving up some of what we have to help lift up other people. And then for many of us, we're just in this place where we're living month to month, and that's our reality. And it produces humility. But at the same time, the church's, role is to be a community that cares for and meets the needs of each other, not just allows some people to live lavish lives and other people to suffer. And then thirdly, relying on humble responses. Sometimes the most natural thing is just to fight right back, to condescend someone else, to put someone else down. And Paul was talking with them about how they're responding to people. It's not doing whatever you can, to fight back. A lot of times it's just taking something humbly, and instead of cursing someone back, blessing them. Instead of harming somebody back, showing kindness to them. These are basic principles that Jesus teaches a lot as well. But those are some outward signs of humility. And today, Paul's going to take that conversation of humility into one of the specific issues that the Corinthians are dealing with. So this is one of the issues that they've been writing about or talking about. It has to do with correction and consequences. And I would dare say we probably all have a lot of different opinions. Maybe we feel like we have been corrected in poor ways in the past. Maybe we're parents trying to navigate what does correction look like in a family scenario. There's a lot of ways that this has practical application, and maybe a lot of ways that it's harmed us, honestly, because people have misused correction and consequences in our lives in the past. So we're going to reflect on that by seeing how Paul instructs the Corinthians to address a specific situation. And just an alert up front, this is a very severe situation. So you're not going to respond, to your kids who are being too loud in the house with the same kind of severity that Paul responds to this in. Because this is, honestly, it's abusive. And so abuse is just a whole different level of something that needs correction. So we're going to wade into those realms this morning as well and look at how to navigate situations of abuse, which are also very prevalent in our world, just like they were back then. And so first thing that we want to learn is how to answer people's attitudes Sounds a little bit strange because we tend to answer people's actions or, things like that, but we really want to focus in on the attitude. At least that's what Paul challenges the Corinthians to do. He says, now some have become arrogant. Some of the people in this church, a portion of that church, they're acting arrogantly, and this is something that Paul has talked about over and over again thus far in the letter. He says, as though I were not coming to you. So almost this idea of we don't have any form of accountability. In fact, we don't need accountability. We're pretty self-confident. He says, but I'll come to you soon if the Lord wills. So he wants to come in person to Corinth, but for now he has to rely on this letter. He says, and I'll find out not the words of those who are arrogant, but their power. What he's saying is there's a group of people in the church, they're acting kind of arrogantly, and it has to do with their words. And that leads me to believe, based on what's been going on so far in the letter and what Paul's talked about in 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, that they have some arguments they're comfortable in. And we know that the Corinthians, they're relying on what's socially acceptable, they're relying on what's logically acceptable, what's sensible to them, and they're relying on what is sensually acceptable. And we think of sensual like in a bad sense, but I'm just talking about in the sense of our five senses. So they're looking at what they're doing and they're saying society approves of it. It makes logical sense to me. And like using my five senses, it feels like the right thing to do. So this is what we're doing. But Paul says the response is actually pretty arrogant because it completely leaves God out of the picture. That's what he brings up next. He says, for the kingdom of God, it's not in words. It's not in how powerful of an argument you have or how much you conform to society or how well you interpret your five senses. Like, it's not that. The proof of it is in power. So in reality, they're not really living spiritual lives like people in God's kingdom should. In other words, they're not letting God's Spirit or God's revealed information, we would maybe call that Scripture today or the Bible today. At that point in time, the truths that they have in the church, things from the Old Testament portion of the Bible, which is already around at that point in time, but they're not letting God's revelation and God's Spirit influence them, and they're certainly not letting the way that Jesus lived influence them. They're just looking to society and their own logic and their senses to interpret that. And Paul says that's kind of an arrogant attitude to have in your church. He says next, what do you desire? That I come to you with a rod or with unconditional love and a spirit of gentleness? Now, Paul is not going to beat down the door of the church in Corinth with a literal physical rod and start beating them. That's not what he's talking about. He's using an illustration because, honestly, in ancient Greek and Roman culture, sometimes the powers that be in cities would, as a punishment, actually beat people with rods. That happened to Paul one time when he was arrested and falsely accused. Some of the leaders in the city actually had him beaten with rods, and they got in trouble for it because he was a Roman citizen. And so that was actually a real thing that happened in their culture, but Paul's drawing on that as an illustration of like a very forceful act of discipline or a very lenient act of discipline. And what he's saying in this context is, if you were humble, I could approach you with love and with gentleness. I could be really lenient in what I'm about to suggest and what I have been suggesting. But you're being really arrogant. And so if I show up in person and I still have to address these issues, I'm going to have to be a little more firm, a little more forceful, a little more severe in how I approach this. And I actually think that can be a great thing for us, let me go back one more slide, to contemplate. Let me tell you a quick story. So Christine and I, we were new parents, specifically when our first child, our daughter, was about maybe a year and a half old. We already knew that she knew how to do stuff like differently than what we asked, but there was a point where she started using the word no, right? We're asking her to do stuff and then no comes out. And so as parents, we're like, well, okay, this is a new thing because now she can talk and now she can tell us no. And how do we navigate this? Like, how do we help correct her and discipline her and lead her? And some of the I guess what we'd received so far as like advice from people was, you've got to be pretty harsh. You've got to use physical discipline or else your kids won't get it and they'll turn into hooligans someday. And so the problem is when we thought about this, we were looking at a 1.5 to a 2-year-old. And we thought, well, we can do spanking or we can do physical discipline, but this just doesn't quite feel right to us. I know different people navigate parenting and discipline differently. And so maybe you navigate things differently. But for us, we were looking at this, again, very young child who was very humble, who had overall a personality that was pretty compliant. And we were thinking, just because she told us no at 1.5 or 2 years old, do we need to be that forceful? And I think that this answering the attitude principle is something really to weigh. And we just, for whatever reason, personally chose to go a more gentle route. And I think what we were up against is we were realizing that even biblically, this is an okay route. To try to match the correction with the level, with the attitude, with the level of humility that's present. And maybe when there's more defiance and more arrogance, there needs to be more firmness. And maybe when there's more humility and understanding, there can be more gentleness. And I think that's what Paul is kind of bringing out into this conversation about correction. And so I would say one thing we should consider from this, whether it's as parents or it's in the workplace as managers or it's in some sort of leadership position in the community or in our neighborhoods, maybe we have to make corrections from time to time or suggestions or give advice to people to correct actions or the ways we see things are headed. And I would say maybe we should go about that by considering the attitude of the people that we're trying to correct. If there's overall humility, maybe we can come at it at a very gentle and loving conversational level. And if there's a lot of arrogance, perhaps, again, there needs to be a lot more firmness to that. Just something to consider as we look at correction and consequences. But for Paul, he realized with what's going on in Corinth, I need to be more firm, maybe even forceful to some degree. Now we're going to get into a specific situation. There's an accusation that's being made here at this point in time. And as we get into this, what we're going to see is actually Paul judging someone in the Corinthian church. And where that causes a little bit of a problem for us is that 2 chapters earlier, or chapter and a half earlier, Paul just finished telling the Corinthians not to judge each other. So now he's going to contradict his own advice, and he's going to start pronouncing judgment on somebody inside of their church. So what gives? What's different? Because he's just said, you can't see the hidden motives of people's hearts, and you can't see all the hidden details. So be really careful about judging people and situations in a church. So why is he going to turn around and judge people and a situation in a church? Why is he making an exception to that rule? And I think we'll find out more of that reason as we walk through this second part and we look at this accusation, the details. Here's a couple things to consider up front that are just good when you're trying to figure out what's going on. First of all, when there's an accusation that's being made, is it really accurate? And this causes a lot of issues sometimes because people make assumptions, people go off of gossip, right? It's a human thing to do. Somebody said it, and I believe that person, so I'm just going to base my actions on that assumption. But how can we really know if some actions really taking place that we should be concerned about? Most of the time, we're going to have face-to-face conversations with the people that are involved. There's going to be different sides, different points of view. So if we really want to understand a situation that's going on, we're going to have to talk to people. If one of my kids bursts in the room and says, my brother hit me, I need to have a conversation and figure out what brought that about. Did he hit his brother first? Did he insult his brother? What caused this so that we can respond properly? There's some basic things that we have to do to kind of assess situations. And in this case, Paul actually skips that step, which I would say in most cases you wouldn't want to do, but here's why. He says it's actually, and that word, all these words in our English New Testaments go back to Greek words in the original writings of the New Testament, and then some of them are linked to Hebrew words in the Old Testament as well. But this word actually, it means everywhere, literally. So what he's saying is everywhere it's reported that there is sexual immorality, and he's talking about either prostitution or adultery or incest among you as a church. He's saying this is public knowledge. I could go talk to the people that don't even, they're not even a part of your church in Corinth. I could walk up to just people that, know people in the community, and everybody knows what's happening in your church. Somebody in your church is having an affair with his stepmom, And that's the details. It comes out in the next verse. So this is a severe thing, even in Roman and Greek culture, which is really permissive. Now, just to give you an idea of probably why these things are happening, in Roman culture, Greek culture, it was not unusual for people to marry individuals who were much younger than they were, for men to marry much younger women. A lot of women were married around the age of 12, sometimes younger than that, to men who were in their 20s and 30s. And what very well might have happened in this situation, since we're talking about someone's stepmom, is very common for women to die in childbirth at this point in time. And so perhaps his mom died in childbirth or of some other way, some illness. There could have been divorce or something that happened, but in this society, the most common way for people, the reason for people to remarry was death of a spouse. And so perhaps his mom died for some reason. He remarried someone much, much younger, very close to his son's age, probably is what happened. And so that would make all of these scenarios even more likely. But it says, and sexual immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, the non-Jewish cultures. Namely, that somebody has his father's wife, and that's where we know, it's this person's stepmom that he's having an affair with. And so Paul begins to bring the church into some ways to assess this accusation of what's happening. And the first thing he's going to basically say is, how is it affecting your community? And that verse gives us some clues. The city is seeing this thing, and everyone's aware of it. It's public knowledge, and they're witnessing this relationship that even by Roman and Greek standards, it's unacceptable, it's illegal, it's against Roman law, it's an act of incest under Roman law, and it's something that is extremely dishonoring to the head of the family, to the father figure, which is this young man's dad. So the city is seeing this happen on a corporate level, and then the father is being emotionally abused because he's basically being shamed in front of the city by this action, and the stepmom is being sexually abused by somebody that's a member of the Corinthian church. So that's the specific case. I mean, this is a pretty severe thing that's happening. Now Paul looks at the church itself. He says, you've become arrogant and you haven't mourned instead, so that the one who's done this deed would be removed from your midst. He's saying, instead of this being a problem for most of you as a church, like you've been very approving of what's happening here. And so we see that it's having an impact on the church itself. Many people are approving of the abuse that's happening, and they're becoming more arrogant, and Paul realizes that they're actually in danger of abusing people themselves, because it's a pretty small step from justifying abuse that someone else is committing to justifying your own abuse, okay? And Paul sees this. If they keep walking down this road, there's going to be more abuse that's accepted in the church, and more people are going to get on board and be supportive, and that's going to encourage more people to abuse more people because it'll be supported in that environment. And Paul, on the other hand, and another group within the church who have brought these concerns to Paul, meanwhile, they're grieving that this is happening within a community of people who are supposed to be following Jesus and loving each other. Instead, there's abuse it's happening, but it's being accepted and even maybe encouraged. And there's division that's happening in the church as well over this. And Paul's talked about how in previous chapters, they're kind of an immature group of people. They're very divisive. They have their own teams that they're on. This is just another thing that's causing more people to divide. Some people say, well, this is fine. And other people are looking at it and saying abuse is not fine. So he's looking at how this is affecting the church. And then finally, he's going to look at in a few minutes how it's actually affecting the culprit, the abuser himself. And he's being encouraged to not only oppose God, but to destroy lives, to destroy his dad's life, his stepmom's life, and maybe even, you could say, his own life in different ways, because undoubtedly this will harm him as well. And so there's a lot of different impacts on a lot of different groups of people. And as we look at correction and consequences, sometimes we have to look at the impact. Is this something that's pretty minimalized, or is this something that's having an effect on a community, on a church, on a family? Is it something that's harming people's lives? Is it something that's harming an individual's life? And so it's not an easy answer, but it's just areas that we need to consider as we give correction and consequences. We need to consider the scope of what's happening. And that's kind of what Paul's leading the Corinthian church into doing. He says in verse 3, he says, "For I on my part, though absent in body," and this is going to be really strong, it's going to seem really extreme, so we want to unpack this for a minute. "On my part, though absent in body," so he's not physically present in Corinth, but present in spirit. His spirit is very much aware of and concerned with what's going on there. "I've already judged him who has so committed this, as though I were present." So Paul's saying, I've already decided, just like if I were there in person, what needs to happen in this situation. He says, "In the name of our Lord Jesus," which gives this idea that Paul feels that Jesus would also support this course of action. "When you are assembled," so this is supposed to be something that the church is supposed to take on like together and deal with together, which I would argue is not always the case either. But in this extreme situation, Paul feels like he and Jesus and the church need to approach what's going on this way because it's abuse. He says, "And I with you in spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus, I have decided," it's actually it's not in the original text. It's in italics in your translations. And so it's either Paul saying, I've decided this, or I'm more likely, I'm recommending this course of action to you as a church. "To turn such a person over to Satan for the destruction of his body, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord." What is that talking about? Isn't that crazy? Doesn't that sound extreme? We're going to just turn this person over to Satan so that his body gets destroyed and his spirit can be saved. That sounds very extreme. And I want to unpack for you what I think that's talking about. I could be wrong, but this is what I believe is happening. He says he's advising the church to hand this abuser over to Satan, or the Satan. Now we think of Satan as like the devil, right? And it does refer to that spiritual being who is in opposition to God. But the word Satan itself means opponent. So I think we need to just understand that in context. This person's being handed over to God's opponent. Why is that happening? Let me walk you through my logical process, and you can agree or disagree, on your own based on what you're seeing. But first of all, Paul thinks this abuser is being arrogant. So he's coming at things more forcefully or firmly, less leniently than if this abuser were extremely humble and repentant and willing to change, maybe in our day and age, willing to get counseling and help professionally to overcome this, right? But this person is, at this point, very unapproachable, very arrogant, set in their ways. So Paul's going to come across more forcefully with his correction and consequences than he would if this individual were humble. Second thing, in reality, the abuser is already carrying out the work of God's opponent. So handing him over to God's opponent, in practicality, it's not doing much. Paul and Jesus and the church, what they're really doing is they're freeing him to follow his own desires, which are to be abusive, and to follow his true leader, which is God's opponent. He's not following Jesus in that course of action. He's following the Satan or the opponent or the adversary in that. And so the church is saying, essentially, if you want to go follow that way, we're going to release you from us, from our care and protection and maybe even guilt, conscience, whatever. We're going to let you go to follow your harmful desires and your true leader, in a sense. And so now the responsibility of discipline, it's shifted away from the church, because we're going to see in a few moments, what they're doing is they're removing him from that community. And so now they're not responsible for disciplining that individual or correcting or bringing consequences. Now it's left up to the one who specializes in tearing people down. Church is about building people up. But God's opponent, Satan, the opponent, the adversary, is a specialist in tearing people down. And so the church doesn't waste time trying to change somebody who doesn't want to change over and over again. And they're also protecting themselves and the people who are being subjected to the abuse, as we'll see in a few moments. Also, the destruction that Satan and just the natural consequences of opposing God by carrying out abuse, the destruction that that naturally causes, it's going to bring problems, it's going to bring pain, it's going to bring suffering to that individual's life. And over time, I think what Paul's saying by destroying that person's body is all those consequences, natural consequences, consequences that God's opponent who specialized in tearing people down even brings into that individual's life. It starts to break down that abuser on a physical level, but also on the level of human nature, where there's been arrogance, there's been pridefulness, there's been maybe a power trip and a desire to view yourself as so much better than other people. Gradually, those feelings start to get replaced, and you begin to have feelings like, I don't know if this is worth it. It's taking a toll on me, on my body, on my mind, and you start to feel convicted and even question how you're treating other humans, and all this is kind of building. And after a while, you start to become a little more poor in spirit, a little more powerless, a little more humble. And maybe at that point, it even leads you to a place where you're ready to be rescued from God's judgment. You're ready to come back home. It almost sounds in that phrase that Paul gave, about give so that his spirit can be saved at the day of the Lord. It almost sounds like Paul is just wishing that he dies so that his spirit can go to heaven someday. And I don't think that's really what's happening here, because it's not really what happens. If you read 2 Corinthians, you see this guy actually has a huge turnaround. And Paul has to instruct the Corinthians, because this man has stopped being an abuser, to actually comfort him and receive him back into the community. Because they still want to stay at arm's length, even though this guy has completely changed his ways. He's been very humbled. And I think what you see play out is what Paul was hoping for when he spoke those words just a few lines earlier. I also think it's a very good illustration of Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. You remember the story? There's a guy that decides he wants all of his father's inheritance before his dad actually passes away. So he demands that the dad give him the inheritance so he can go and use it how he wants. Dad says, for some weird reason, okay, have it. Guy goes to faraway land, spends it on living, completely selfish living in many different ways. And then he's completely broken in a field, feeding pigs, has no money to buy food for himself. The pig food's starting to look really, really good. And he hits rock bottom and realizes, things would be so much better for me back at my dad's house. And the dad in the parable is depictive of God. And so sometimes we have to kind of hit rock bottom. God has to bring us to a very humble place before we want to be rescued out of it. And I really think that's what, through those very serious sounding lines, I think that's what Paul is hoping will happen to this man. And in fact, it is actually what happens to this man as we look ahead into the future, into the letter of 2 Corinthians. Verse 6, now he's going to shift, because he's been addressing how to respond to the abuser and the abuse. Now he's going to address the church a little bit. He says, your boasting is not good. You guys are supporting abuse. That's not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? So he's saying, your support of this abuse is like a little bit of yeast and some bread. Pretty soon it's going to spread. He says, clean out the old leaven or the old yeast so you can be a new lump of dough, just as you are in fact unleavened. So he's saying, because of your faith in Jesus, you have been forgiven of the many harmful ways that you've been living in. That's the way that you really are. You're really forgiven, so live like it, in a sense. He says, for Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Therefore, let's celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven or yeast, or with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So he's using an illustration based on a Jewish feast, the Feast of Passover, where they would clear all the yeast out of their house. They would only eat unleavened bread for 7 days and sacrifice the Passover lamb and all of these things. And he's saying essentially, why don't you try to honor Christ and celebrate Christ? Currently, you're ignoring abuse. And maybe even you're approving of abuse. But that's only going to spread abuse like yeast spreads through bread. And it's only going to dishonor Christ. It won't celebrate him. And so why don't you focus on celebrating Christ by disapproving of this abuse in your midst, basically. Verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I didn't at all mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the greedy, or swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you'd have to leave the world. He's saying his advice is being narrowed to how to deal with this situation within the context of a church community, a group of people who have faith in Jesus and claim to be following Jesus with their lives. And so he says, I wrote to you in my previous letter. We don't have this letter. Didn't survive history. Maybe it wasn't intended to. But this isn't the first letter to Corinth. And previously, he's already had a conversation about some things. And he says, I just want to make a clarification. I don't want you as followers of Jesus to judge or avoid or disassociate with people outside of the church. And those types of people, those groups of people are going to be in this group, a verse later, that, different types of abuse, essentially. And I don't think he's telling them rush headlong into abusive relationships just as long as people aren't out, in the church. But what he is saying is you can't hold people who are outside of Jesus to the standards of someone who's following Jesus, because they're not following Jesus. And so that's something that we try to apply in our relationships. We have so many friends who are so many places religiously, many of whom do not believe in Jesus or recognize Jesus or believe that the Bible is truth from God or any of that. And so as we navigate those friendships, we have to allow people an incredible amount of room, because we're just at a different place. We're trying to follow a different way of life that we believe Jesus has led us into, but they're not there. And so we're not supposed to isolate ourselves from people who aren't following Jesus' way, who are outside the church, because that would mean somehow escaping from the world, or finding 300 acres of land in the woods in Alaska somewhere and just going and living there for the rest of your life, where you wouldn't be encountered by another human soul. You can't get away from what's happening in the world, and we shouldn't. Verse 11, he said, but actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother or sister if he's a sexually immoral person, or a greedy person, or an idolater, or is verbally abusive, or habitually drunk, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a person. And what I believe he's doing there is naming additional categories of abuse. And in the way that I kind of phrase an explanation of that, I'll kind of point that out in just a moment. But when I look at those categories, verbally abusive is very, flagrant, very obvious. But the other things, I believe, are different categories of abuse. And he's saying, when it comes to people abusing people, don't even associate or eat with people like that. And then he goes back, he says, what business of mine is it to judge outsiders, people outside of the church? And his rhetorical question is answered with, none of my business. That's what it is. It's not my business. He says, do you not judge those who are within the church? And again, he just told us a chapter or two before, don't judge the people inside of the church. But there are situations where judgment is necessary within the church. And it seems to be when things, there is a point where, in most cases, judging other people, comparing people, criticizing what's going on in other people's lives, comparing people with you, comparing you with people, in most cases, that does more harm than it does good. But there are some situations where ignoring something does more harm than good. And this is, I would propose to you all that this is one of those situations where ignoring something causes far more harm than good. And so again, that's something that's kind of nuanced. We have to use discernment to figure that out. Because, a lot of times if we get too judgy, we're just going to cause more problems. But sometimes if we don't step in and try to correct someone, it's going to cause more problems. And there isn't, we have to discern that in this process of correction a lot of times. Not always easy. But he's saying in this case, there are times to judge people within the church where it's going to prevent harm. He says, but those who are outside God judges. Remove the evil person from among yourselves. And even the word evil itself has a meaning behind it that doesn't always come through in our English translations. So there's two words. This is a quote from Deuteronomy. Different verses in Deuteronomy use this phrase, remove the evil person from among you. And that goes back to a Hebrew word that's talking about someone who's causing pain, essentially. And then the Greek word that's used when Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians years and years ago, almost 2 millennia ago, it also means somebody who's causing pain. And so the idea behind this word, evil person, it's somebody who gets satisfaction by inflicting pain on other people. Or we would call that an abuser, right? different forms of abuse, but somehow I get satisfaction from causing somebody else pain and harm. And so that's the context of what's happening. He does challenge the church at Corinth to remove and cut off relationships with people who inflict pain for personal gain, people who are abusive, through sexual, because that list that he mentions, the swindlers, the people who are verbal abusers, it's sexual abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, verbal abuse, drunken abuse, or physical abuse. Those are the categories that he's naming. And so he's saying when it comes to people who are abusing people in these ways, there has to be a separation of relationship. When I've heard people talk about this passage in the past, I've heard them use it for many different levels, I guess, of severity, in many cases, and I've seen it misapplied a lot. And so I think what we need to take away from this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of application. This is a very severe instance, and it's an illustration of how to deal with abuse in a community. But we can learn a lot of principles for how to deal with correction and consequences through it. And here's a quick summary of what I took away from this, like the 3 main takeaways that I had that are going to challenge me, and hopefully there'll be things that challenge you as well. What can we learn about correction and consequences from this one specific, pretty serious situation in ancient Corinth? One, I think it's wise to allow the attitudes of other people to affect the leniency or severity of the correction that we provide. Consider the attitude. And if somebody is humble and compliant, don't come down harshly. It's not necessary, and it might cause more harm than good. At the same time, when somebody is very arrogant and non-compliant, perhaps being loving and humble and not firm enough will not be effective. So answer the attitude. Secondly, determine if accusations are accurate. You might have to do some homework. In most situations, unless the whole town's talking about it and everyone knows, you'll probably have to have conversations to determine the accuracy of what's going on or what's being said. And to what extent people are really being affected. I know I've seen people react very harshly in the past with very extreme consequences to something that affected essentially no one. And again, those things are out of balance. So how are people really being affected? How's the community, the church, an organization perhaps, your own family, other individuals, the person themselves? How are they being affected? Maybe you'll have to match the level of correction and consequences with the impact that's actually happening. Being too judgmental may cause more harm in most cases. Sometimes you might just choose to drop something and let it go because it's going to cause more harm than good. It's a small thing. In other cases, correction and consequences might be necessary, but to lesser degrees. The person is not abusing their stepmom. Abuse isn't being perpetuated in a church or a family or an organization. So maybe it doesn't need to be quite that extreme. Maybe you don't need to have prayers and commit that person to Satan, right? Because it's a smaller issue. But then sometimes there are severe issues. But our example, again, it was abuse, which is very, very severe. Third, instead of ignoring or maybe even approving of various forms of abuse, and this could be in a family, in an organization, in a church, in a community, address them with the proper authorities. Sometimes it's going to mean someone talking to the abuser. Sometimes it's going to mean somebody talking perhaps to the police or to someone in authority, or perhaps working with professional counselors or therapists, different resources that are available in the community to help this person navigate the abuse if they're humble enough to see it and to want to work through it. Sometimes it's going to mean, again, alerting authorities. Abusive individuals who persist in abuse are probably going to need to be separated from survivors and communities, because what happens in that process is their power gets broken. And I think that's what we saw with the prodigal son, and that's what we see with how this played out in this individual's life over the next few years in ancient Corinth. Once he was separated from the community, from the acceptance of abuse, from the people that he was abusing, at that point, the power to abuse was broken, and his spirit could be brought back to this place of poverty and humility. But without that separation, it just keeps enabling a cycle of abuse. There's kind of a lot of deep and kind of serious things, right, in this conversation. How to navigate abuse, but also how to navigate just basic correction, instruction with our own kids, with our students at school, people in our lives, giving advice, pointing people in the right direction. So all the different levels, but some things that we can take away as a group from that.